Well, welcome to another conversation and interview session as part of the Innovation Entrepreneurship stream at Stronger 2021. It is a pleasure to welcome my friend Simon Hay onto here as we spend a bit of time with him gleaning some fresh insights and learnings from Simon's enormous experience in entrepreneurship and business. Simon is a co-founder of an award-winning EdTech company, FireFly. And it's a global tech firm that works with institutions around the world. We're going to find out more about it, though, in the next half an hour or so. And it's a particular joy of mine to interview Simon today because he used to live just around the corner from us here in West London and has been part of our church before he moved to another part of London and starting family and all of that stuff. Simon, welcome. Great to see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
It is so nice to see you. And where actually are you tuning in from right now, Simon?
I'm in Wimbledon. I'm in my front room. We've put a plank of wood across the window and turned that into a desk for emergency pandemic working.
Well, I think that's going to be a familiar sort of setup across everyone's homes across the country, aren't they? Makeshift sort of setups around the place in front rooms. Exactly. Wow. Really good to see you, Simon. Tell me, just to give us a little bit of insight into the last 7-8 months. Have you Netflix series, any books that you've been reading?
No, I've been extremely boring, actually. I've been working very hard and looking after a small baby. And between the two of those things, I am done. Hobbies, social life, all gone out the window, I'm afraid.
You're amazing to be still standing, Simon. You look great. You look fresh-faced. Look, love to know what has been, I mean, maybe you just answered it, the steepest learning curve of that you've been on during lockdown.
I think parenting in a pandemic is definitely new for everyone and hard for everyone. You read a lot about the challenges there, and I don't think I've got any great insights to offer on how to solve it, unfortunately. But that definitely adds a new dimension. You know, it's challenging for us as grown-ups who understand what's going on and can reason about and accept things to deal with the circumstances we've been thrown. It's much harder, I think, for small people to process that. And you can't expect as much of them, but that definitely makes life more interesting for people who are trying to juggle looking after kids, trying to help keep them learning, and potentially the demands of work on the side. And I know, across our business, we've got a lot of people who are trying to keep all of those balls in the air, and it's just really tough. I don't think there's any good answers there.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Hey, Simon, I love it. If those who haven't heard of FireFly, I wonder whether you could just say what it is and what's the vision behind it.
Yeah, so we are a software as a service company that aims to improve learning experiences and ultimately learning outcomes for school-age students by connecting them and their teachers and their parents together. So we really focus on two things. One is learning continuity and helping people keep learning going online, whatever the circumstances. And that's clearly become a very hot topic in the last year or so. I felt for a while like I was a voice crying out in the wilderness, and all of a sudden it's become totally mainstream. So that's been an interesting journey. And the other is parent engagement. So if you look at the academic research, engaged parents are one of the key drivers of learning outcomes for students. So we work on how can we help involve parents effectively in a kind of partnership with the school around their children's learning, so that they can be collaborators rather than either kind of kept in the dark or disengaged, or kind of wanting to help but not knowing how.
Yeah, that's so good. I'd love to think about this idea, sort of next section of questions and discussion, thinking about concept to launch. And you came up with this idea at some point. I'd love to know, I'd love to get under the skin of that and where that came about. I wonder whether you could tell us a bit about your passion for business and technology. Is that something that you've always had, or is that something that you discovered?
Yeah, definitely passion for technology goes back a long way. My parents met when they were both working at IBM. So I kind of grew up with computers around, and I remember sitting on my dad's knee and playing Space Invaders on one of the original IBM PCs and this kind of thing. So I was sort of immersed in that, I guess, from a pretty early age. I taught myself to code reasonably young and so on. So I've always been pretty geeky. I'm not sure that I can reasonably claim a passion for business, probably even now. I guess that's that's sort of a vehicle, right? It's a means to an end rather than an end in itself. I think I do have a passion for the impact that we're trying to have, for the change that we want to make in the world. I think education has never been more important. It's clearly one of the differentiators between people who benefit from the waves of automation and globalization that are happening, whether we like it or not, and people who suffer real hardship. And it's one of the few remaining industries that hasn't, industries is a bad word, they're sectors, spaces that hasn't been transformed by tech in the way that most others have been. So I think it's kind of only right that tech ought to play its part in improving education outcomes, because that's partly the way that it can undo some of the damage that it's perhaps doing to people's chances and opportunities elsewhere. And I think that there's a huge amount to do there, but a huge opportunity. It could make a real difference if you read across to education the difference that technology's made in other areas of life, which look pretty unrecognizable now to how they did 50 years ago. And so this company is kind of a way of trying to make some of that happen.
And Simon, I'd love you to take us back to where you were when this sort of came about. I know it was you and a school friend, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so this was never intended to end like this. We never meant to create a global business. And probably my story is terrible advice to anyone who's watching this, kind of thinking about setting out in entrepreneurship and creating business plans and doing all those sensible things that you really ought to do, right? Because we didn't do any of that. We started this to solve our own problems. We were two kids at school and we were frustrated with not being able to do things online, because this was like 99, 2000. So the internet was really starting to take off in every aspect of life except school. And I remember being pretty fed up having to cycle into school to hand in work or pick up notes or ask questions when I didn't understand things and I was meant to be on study leave. And we thought there had to be a better way. And I remember surveying the chaos of revision notes on my bedroom floor and thinking there had to be a better way. And I was the kind of kid who thought it might be more fun to create that better way than to actually file the notes and do some work. So originally, this was basically a procrastination technique. You know how a bit like when you color code all your notes and file them nicely instead of actually learning them, that kind of thing. But I think we sort of realized that it had legs, that it wasn't actually just us. It sort of spread throughout our school, largely driven by the students, by students going to teachers and saying, hey, this thing's really useful, the way that they're doing it in this other subject. Can you do that too? And we realized it wasn't our school being backward. It was a general problem that schools around London, and it turns out around the world, all faced, and no one was really solving. So we kind of fell into this by accident. By the time we were doing A-levels, we were being pulled out of lessons to fix things and answer questions and explain how it worked. We went off to uni together, and our school was really dependent on it by that point. So they said, will you keep looking after this for us? And we said, sure, in exchange for some beer money and so on. And, these were in the days when tuition fees weren't nearly as high as they are today. And for quite a lot of years, we did this as a hobby, kind of evenings, weekends, spare time alongside degrees and real jobs. And that had a number of advantages, actually. It'd be very hard for me to replicate today. But at the time, it was sort of fairly low risk for us because we were in education or we were in full-time employment that was paying the bills. So this was sort of experimentation and the stakes weren't too high. And it let us get kind of product market fit, which I think is a really critical moment in the kind of life cycle of any business. In slow time before we were trying to put food on the table with this. So at the point that we quit our jobs to concentrate on it full time, we knew we were onto something. We had, we'd refined the product in collaboration with a handful of early adopter customers. And we kind of knew it was solving a real problem and there were more people out there like them that had that same problem. And so it was more a question of scale. I think one of the real challenges that a lot of startups have is that they need to, they raise some money, but now it's sort of race against time to find that product market fit, to build a product that kind of is pulled off the shelves, rather than you having to kind of really fight uphill to persuade anyone of its usefulness before the cash runs out. So yeah, we were very fortunate being able to do it that way, but that would be very hard for me to replicate now when I've got a family and commitments and so on. We just sort of grew organically, and I think there was a point where we realized, hey, this could be big, but that certainly wasn't the intention starting out.
It's really interesting to hear some of that early journey of FireFly, and just thinking about, again, under this sort of heading concept to launch, you're in this early stage. I'd love to know from your point of view, did you have key mentors that you were tapping into at that stage, or was that something that came later?
I've definitely had help from a variety of mentors through the journey. It has been different people at different stages. So, in the very early days, there were a couple of teachers who took a real chance on us. Because it was quite a scary thing, actually, a school becoming dependent on something that was created by kids. And in hindsight, it was pretty brave of them to allow that. So there were people who helped us then. When I did my PhD, my supervisor had a fantastically successful career in industry alongside his career in academia. So it was a great person to kind of help me blend those two worlds and give me advice on both sides of what I was doing. Since then, we've had quite a lot of help, actually largely from networks of kind of like-minded peers. So we've been part of various programs that put together companies at similar stages and so on, whether that's through investor cohorts or Tech Nations programs, which I'd really recommend to anybody who's following a similar path. And so, it's definitely helpful to talk to people who've been this way before you and learn from their mistakes rather than making them all yourself. But it's also really helpful to talk to people who are going through it now, and who can kind of empathize with some of the struggle, because with the benefit of hindsight, some of that does tend to fade, and you see the world through more rose-tinted glasses, and sort of things seem obvious to you now that really weren't obvious at the time.
Are there things that you would have done differently with the benefit of hindsight if you were to launch again?
I would have done less. So I think one of the hardest things is saying no, but actually it's critical that you can do that, with kindness and with good intention. But especially when you're small, it's really easy to get pulled in all directions, whether that's by important clients, and they're taking a chance on you and you need to impress them. So you feel like you need to agree to everything that they say, or whether that's with partners or colleagues, or even with yourself, because I think often a lot of entrepreneurially minded people have 100 good ideas. And the challenge is that just being a good idea isn't enough. It has to be kind of the best idea, the best thing that you can spend your scarce time or money or kind of emotional energy or resources on at that moment. And I think it's very easy to spread yourself too thin and to do a mediocre job of a bunch of different things rather than really being world-beating at anything. Whether that's kind of building too big and complicated a product, or trying to go after too many different markets at once. I think one of the really good bits of advice that I got was sort of trying to really focus and do something really well, even if that's a small thing in a small market, finding a niche that you can then expand from, but being able to point at, look, we're great over here, so trust us, we're going to be great over there too, rather than sort of going horizontally first.
And just to drill down a bit more onto that, Simon, like how did you work out what you were going to focus on? As you said, you could have focused on a range of things, but you had to streamline. What principles were you using to do that?
I guess you sort of think, where do I have an unfair advantage here? What is it that makes me uniquely able to do this better than anybody else can? Because everyone will have an unfair advantage at something, and our different sets of experiences and perspectives and skills and so on mean that will be different in each case. And as your business grows, it becomes about where the business has an unfair advantage rather than just you. And so that's about things like your market position and your customers and the people that you've got and kind of capabilities. But if there's no particular reason why you can do this better than anybody else, then maybe we should just leave it to somebody else and instead focus on the things where actually we've got an unfair advantage that's going to compound over time. If we really double down there and we're already kind of ahead of the curve, then we can, you get this kind of compounding effect. And that means you're in a much stronger position then to go and focus on the things where maybe we're weaker. At least you can do that from a much more secure, comfortable perch.
That's brilliant. That's a really fascinating insight, because I know there are going to be people over this last 8-9 months who have had an opportunity to begin dreaming dreams again, or just because the busyness of usual life has meant that things have got buried. And I'm convinced that this time has acted. Yes, there's been some pruning and things have been cut back and it's been challenging, but I think there will, to some extent, lockdown has been a greenhouse for some people. And I think what you've described is really really insightful for people.
I was just going to say, I'm an eternal optimist, and I think there are silver linings from even this kind of global tragedy. I think that it's easier now than it's ever been to create something that's truly distributed, like Stronger Network is, right? This is something that you've pulled together with hundreds of people, many of whom have never met in real life, which is kind of incredible and would have been hard to imagine doing even a year or two ago. I think that maybe the kind of economic climate and so on will give people a nudge to try something. And do something different. And I think that if you can get something off the ground in this, which is really the toughest of times, that business is going to thrive in sort of more hopeful conditions. And there's lots of published research actually that shows that. If you look at a lot of the most successful businesses out there, many of them were started in periods of recession or other kind of really challenging climates, and it kind of forces you to kind of be able to scratch about and operate in a lean way, and kind of be efficient in a way that maybe you could get away without in other circumstances. But those are sort of corporate habits that will stand you in really good stead.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so thinking about infrastructure of business, you've been leading this business for years, and I'm just thinking again back in those early days. You and your co-founder, your partner, how did you, for example, just drilling down into quite granular, detail, love to know, how did you decide who was going to do what, for example? Was it quite a clear delineation?
Yeah, no, in the early days, that was pretty organic and it varied a lot. There was just a pile of work to get done and we sort of divided it up without too much thought. And I think that let us figure out for ourselves what actually we were good at and what actually we enjoyed. And hopefully there's some overlap between those two things. But actually there's always some stuff that no one particularly enjoys, but that just has to happen. And actually there's probably some stuff that you're good at, but that maybe you don't really want to spend your time on, that doesn't excite you or you don't have the same passion for. I think that so I wouldn't necessarily recommend that as an approach. I think, we should have been more thoughtful early on about that. But we were really young. We didn't actually know what our strengths and weaknesses and preferences were. We were sort of learning that about ourselves as we went. And I think, if we were starting something now, I'm much more self-aware and have better understanding of that. I think we always did try to kind of put the needs of the business first. And so we would think about well, this is what needs to happen at the moment, and so that's what I'm going to do. More recently, we've become much more thoughtful and much more deliberate, and we sort of had to as the business expands and other people need clarity on who should I talk to about this and so on, and you just want to get more efficient. And we have tried to play to those kind of strengths and preferences and so on. So, for example, my co-founder is more organized, has better attention to detail than I can, is far better at implementing processes and systems and structures and so on. And so naturally he's tended to kind of take ownership of all the aspects of the business that where those kind of skill sets and strengths really make the most difference. But I do think that's a kind of that needs to be a constant dialogue, because it can be a real source of tension and friction otherwise. And I think if that's sort of not brought to the surface and agreed, it will definitely make life harder.
And I think that's key, isn't it? Communication. If you felt that both of you felt strongly about taking it in two different ways, have you come across that yourself, and how do you navigate that?
I think we've been remarkably aligned on vision, and I think that's been a huge help. I think we've definitely had differences of opinion all the time on kind of how best to achieve that, but we've been aligned on what it is that we're trying to achieve. And in a way that takes a lot of the heat out of it, right? Because it becomes a much more technical conversation about sort of execution rather than sort of differences of values or differences of kind of ambition or of direction. I think one of the things that we've learnt to do much more deliberately and explicitly over time is to think about how much a decision matters and how strongly I feel about it. Because quite often, people will have different opinions on something, maybe quite markedly different opinions on something, but one person will care a hell of a lot more about it. It's sort of, I think, sometimes quite helpful to have strong opinions loosely held. My default is this, but actually I'm very willing to be talked out of that. One of the things that we've learned is that there are sort of different classes of decision. There are things where we're both going to agree, and therefore let's not waste any time talking about it. There are things where we're going to disagree, but ultimately it's a kind of matter of style. And either of our ways would work, but we just need to pick one and get on with it and not waste hours arguing, and also not come up with some sort of no man's land compromise in between that doesn't really make anyone happy. And that's often where I think unpicking, well, does someone just care much more about this, helps. Because, if you do, then fine, let's do it your way this time. And the sort of implicit understanding is, we'll do it my way on something that I really feel strongly about, and you can take or leave. And where actually are there things where this is a really important decision and we have different perspectives on it, and it's really worth us now getting in a room and spending half a day thrashing it out, because probably we'll come up with a third way that's far better than either of us originally had in mind, because that's quite often what happens when you bring wider experience and perspective to bear on a problem, right? No one has a monopoly on good ideas, but also where it's really important that actually you are both bought into what is now going to happen. And even if it wasn't the way you wanted to do it, you can kind of disagree and commit and throw yourself behind the path that you've agreed on with as much conviction and passion as if that had been your original intention. There's no room for kind of "I told you so" later.
That's great stuff, Simon. And okay, so just a couple more questions. I'd love to know, it was the two of you started up. Who was your first hire? What role was that?
I think being the first hire into anything is super hard, because it ends up being a mixture of everything. And in particular, it ends up being the things that the founders have least time or energy or enthusiasm for on that particular day. which probably varies quite a lot. So that's a pretty hard job spec to write. In our case, we were very fortunate. We found someone who's absolutely fantastic and a kind of real jack of all trades. But a lot of that was about willingness to try stuff. Nobody in the world is going to be an expert at all of those things. And certainly no founders are experts at any of those things. They just sort of have enough delusion to believe, that they can figure it out as they go. So I think a lot of that came down to kind of mindset and willingness to roll up sleeves and get stuck into whatever the most pressing issue today was, even if that's not actually your comfort zone or your kind of area of expertise. So I think that kind of entrepreneurial spirit is sort of very similar and equally important in early team members as it is in founders. And it's only really when you get a fair bit bigger that you can kind of afford to specialize and rely more on process and systems. And you have to make that transition. And it's one of the really painful things, I think, that every business has to go through, is that kind of evolution from people sort of all just mucking in organically and figuring things out as they go, to becoming much more rigorous and organized and disciplined and deliberate about how you do things.
Simon, I don't know if I can hear a small person in the background, but do feel free if you need to go. Don't hesitate.
No, I think we're all good. But thank you, appreciate it.
Well done. Hey, look, just one more question on this, and that's just getting back into those early days. What was the main thing that was keeping you awake in those times?
I mean, I think it was really fear of letting people down. We'd made a load of promises to clients, to team members, and I would have felt pretty bad if we hadn't been able to deliver on that. I felt like I'd put my sort of credibility on the line a bit there. And in the very early days, if it didn't work, it didn't really matter. I would just get on with my studies, with my real job and so on. But actually, once people are depending on you, as I say, whether that's schools, for example, who were now relying on this to deliver teaching and learning, and it would have had serious impact if it had failed, or whether that's employees who are now depending on you for their livelihoods, that suddenly felt much more real and a sort of much weightier responsibility.
Okay, so then just thinking about leading your business as a sort of heading, and just a couple of questions under that. And we've looked at the early stages of a business, but it's, from what I understand, is I guess something that we've seen here leading a church is that growth isn't linear. It's almost sort of staircase, and you often hit a growth barrier, and then you almost find a solution and you push through that. What have been some of the what are some of the main growth barriers that you've encountered, and how have you navigated those?
It's a great question. I think some of it is these kinds of some of that's external and some of it's internal. So we've come up against sort of external barriers where it's nothing to do with you. The market changes, legislation changes, new competitors come along, things like that. No doubt Brexit and coronavirus have brought that in spades to millions of businesses. And my heart goes out to everyone kind of grappling to adapt and overcome those at the moment. And those will be different, I think, for every business. I think there are also some internal ones where perhaps there's more similarities. So, going from just you to a small team is clearly a kind of major transition moment. We talked about the moment where you kind of need to become more structured and systematic. I think, and there's a number of these kind of milestones in growing up, having middle management for the first time, going international and having team members in other countries. A lot of these things are kind of big steps. There's quite a jump involved in getting there, and almost certainly you kind of have to go backwards before you go forwards. So things like building out a real professional sales team, for example, in businesses that work that way, is obviously totally critical to kind of growth beyond a certain scale, because you as a founder may or may not be a sales expert. I'm certainly not. But even if you're the best sales guy in the world, there's only one of you. So there's a kind of limited amount that you can do. But transitioning from you doing those early sales, for example, where you're conveying your personal story and passion, and you kind of get a buy from people for some of your less polished skills because you're the founder and you're the person who kind of took a risk on it, and you're the person who they believe can make things happen and change the course of the business. When you transition from that to an actual professional doing it, initially it will get worse, because that person doesn't have the same kind of tools to deploy that you had, and you haven't yet made up for it by creating really good kind of sales and marketing material and tools and systems and so on to support that. So, at a lot of these big stepping stone moments, you've got to be prepared actually for things to get worse initially, in order to move to a way that is then more scalable and can make it get better. And a lot of the time it's tempting to just do something yourself. It's always quicker to do something than it is to teach someone how to do something. And so particularly when you're really stressed and you're really busy, and invariably the reason why you need to bring someone else on is because you're really busy and overworked and don't have time for this, that's kind of the hardest moment to say, actually, I'm going to sort of step back and take the time to show somebody else how to do this thing instead of just dealing with it. But you've got to, and it, particularly when you care deeply about something and a lot of your identity and self-worth is bound up in how well this thing does, it really pains you to see it happening less well than it could be done. But if you're not prepared to kind of press through that, I think it will be very hard to reach the next stage, or at least that's what I convinced myself into thinking, to feel better about all of my failings.
Oh, Simon, this is so fascinating. I really appreciated your insights on all of this, and I'd love to know where has God led you or been at work in this whole journey? Maybe thinking about a day-to-day basis, or maybe the bigger picture.
I think, so that's a good distinction. I think that there's two things. One is purpose and the other is execution. I definitely feel called to be working in this space, to be trying to do things that ultimately improve life chances for future generations. And, that's true in my day job, and it's true in the kind of voluntary work I do as well. So that's definitely part of what I think I'm being asked to contribute, and my sort of sense of purpose in life. Education is definitely not the route to fame and fortune. And everyone who works in it, particularly those on the front lines in schools, are absolute heroes, and could all be having less stressful, better remunerated careers elsewhere. But they're choosing to teach because they know it makes a difference. I think the other one is execution, and I hope that kind of my beliefs permeate the way that I behave and the way I interact with people and the way that I make decisions. So, in terms of how you choose to lead and the model that you want to set there, and the kind of behaviors that you want to sort of encourage and so on, I hope that kind of my beliefs influence that. And I think in the early days, the values of the founders to a large extent kind of shape the values that the organization takes on.
It's good, Simon. Thank you on that. And just final question. I'd love to know, as a church leader, there'll be, there are churches up and down the country that will have entrepreneurs and budding entrepreneurs within their communities. I'd love to know any advice for, say, church leaders that might be listening to this, how we can encourage guys like you and make space or champion you guys on. Any advice or insights?
I think one of the things that we're all quite bad at, is sort of making space for failure, and kind of normalizing that and making that something that's accepted and not just tolerated but celebrated for the learnings that invariably come with it. One of the differences in culture, for example, between Silicon Valley and a lot of the UK, I think historically has been that people who try something hard and fail, as you're going to do a lot of the time if you're trying something that's genuinely new and hard, are kind of rewarded for that failure. People go, wow, you were brave enough to try, and okay, it didn't work, but you must have learned quite a lot from that experience that's now going to be valuable in the next thing that you turn your hand to. Whereas I think that, traditionally, a lot of institutions in the UK have kind of frowned on failure and sort of said, oh, he didn't do a very good job of that. Maybe he'll do a bad job of the next thing as well. And that's really put people off trying. It's put people off being willing to take risks and do things that might not work, because they're worried that, not only am I taking a risk on this thing, but I'm taking a risk on my whole kind of future career or people's perceptions of me and so on, because I'll be forever tainted with this, this mark of failure. And I think that's something that we really need to try to shake. I think we ought to be celebrating people being willing to try new things and to experiment, in kind of confident that actually most of those things won't work, but the one that does will make it all worthwhile.
This is ace. Simon, I loved it. I'm loving this conversation. Thank you for all your insights and sharing your experience with us. Thanks, Simon. That's great. And look, we might have a question in here. Some very good points. This is Jerry. Thanks, Jerry. Sorry if I missed the first 5 minutes. You talked about not being too spread. What geography do you cover at present, and why?
So we work with schools in 40 different countries around the world. But about 3/4 of our business is here in the UK, and the other quarter is fairly widely spread. And this was one of the things I said is challenging. I think geography is clearly one kind of very important way of segmenting markets, but it's not the only way. So what we try and do is work with clients who have an awful lot in common apart from geography. So, we've got schools in Switzerland and Singapore and Sydney. Those are a long way apart, but actually a lot of the clients we work with there are very similar size, very similar priorities, very similar challenges. And it's probably easier in our specific case to work with them than to say, I'm going to try and work with every school in Switzerland, when actually that's probably a much more diverse set. But it's not necessarily obvious how you ought to be thinking about segmentation. The trick is drawing lines that are big enough to encompass a kind of market that's worth going at, where, if you get a decent share of that, that's going to be big enough to sustain your organization and let you achieve what you want to, but small enough that actually there is a lot of commonality in that things that you do that are good for one client are going to be good for the others as well. Because if they're all pulling you in different directions, it's going to be very difficult to make any of them happy. And the more, the more disparity there is there, the more complexity there is. The more countries you operate in, the more sets of rules and regulations you have to deal with, and so on. So you sort of want to pick things that are, Goldilocks style, just right. Easier said than done, I think.
Well done, Simon. And thank you again. God bless you, Simon.
Thank you.
We'll connect again soon. Thanks everyone for joining us as well.
Thanks everyone.
See you soon.
Bye.